Hi, I'm Scott Hanselman, and we're here at Microsoft Virtual Academy and continuing the introduction to ASP.NET 5. Today we've got Rowan Miller.
Greetings, thanks for having me.
How are you, sir? We've talked about Model View Controller. We've talked about getting data from the user via an HTTP post, taking that data and then displaying it in a form. We've looked at the kind of the pipeline of ASP.NET 5. But with Rowan right now, this module is going to focus on data in the database, how to talk to the database using a thing called the Entity Framework. It's the way that ASP.NET talks to the database.
Yeah, absolutely. So Entity Framework is an object relational mapper, which simply means we have a relational database, we have some .NET classes, and we want to use some kind of framework to wire up those two so that we can write code against our CLR objects, but that's going to translate into SQL statements against a relational database.
So let's parse that because there's a lot of things there for beginners.
Absolutely,
okay.
yeah.
So an object relational mapper. We saw that in MVC, we mapped, when an HTTP post happened, we mapped that to an object.
Yes.
And in a database, you've got these tables that hold things, and those tables have relationships.
Absolutely.
So an object relational mapper is similar in that it makes you objects from things that live in the database.
Yeah, so in MVC, the model is a set of CLR objects that represent our domain model.
The CLR is .NET, the thing that we're using.
C#, VB, whatever I happen to be coding in.
Right.
So those objects represent our domain model, and then we want, obviously, to store that data in a relational database in some instances. And so a relational database doesn't know how to talk about .NET classes. And so we need some kind of framework to translate what is sometimes called the impedance mismatch between a .NET class and tables and foreign key constraints in a database.
So for what we were doing in our little examples, we had a person object, and person had first name and last name and birth date. We need to figure out how to get that into the database and back.
Absolutely.
In a way that doesn't hurt.
Yeah, absolutely, because like we said, when we're in MVC, we want to talk about models, not relational databases.
Okay, cool.
So you mentioned an example of a model would be a person. For the demo I'm going to walk through, we're going to use something that should be quite familiar, which is products and categories. So this would be the idea of I have a category like clothing or food, and then I have a series of products within that category. This might drive an online website or a warehouse or something like that.
Okay.
So just looking through what I've got a stubbed out MVC application here. I haven't really done anything special in here. So like I mentioned, we have categories.
And that looks just like an object that I would have made. It doesn't look any
Absolutely.
special.
So when we talk about simple objects or things like this, they're often called POCO, which stands for plain old CLR object. And that just means there's no special interfaces, there's no special attributes. I just write a very simple .NET class.
Okay.
So a category, it obviously has an identifier for the category. In my case, I've said that that's a string called category ID. And we have a display name, which is the nice, friendly name we call this thing. And then we also talked about relationships. So a category has a collection of products. I happen to have used the list class here, but I could have used HashSet or iCollection or anything else like that. And then if we look at the product class, again, we'll see it's a very simple object. We have an identifier for it, which is going to map to the primary key in the database. And then we have a set of things like the display name, the price, the recommended retail price, and a link back to the category it belongs to.
Okay.
Now we want to take a look at wiring this up so that we can actually store this data in a database. So I'll close these guys down. I'm just going to quickly look at what I've got installed in this project. So if I look at my NuGet packages I have installed, you'll notice I have Entity Framework.SQL Server. So this is the SQL Server provider for Entity Framework.
Okay.
This allows me to use Entity Framework to talk to a SQL Server database.
And when you said I want to have that package installed, did it bring all of the other dependent packages along?
Yeah, it did. So you notice I've got Entity Framework.core. Further down, you'll see somewhere in here I also have Entity Framework.relational installed as well. And then later we're going to use some commands to perform operations on the database, and so I happen to have also installed the Entity Framework.commands package here as well.
All right.
And we'll talk about that when we actually use that. So the main thing we do when we build an EF model is we create what's called a context. A context represents a session with the database, and it allows us to query and save instances of our objects from the database. So we're going to start by adding a new class. I will call this one product context. And I'm going to inherit from the main class in EF, which is called dbContext. So by inheriting from dbContext, I'm giving this class a set of kind of inherent behaviors that allow it to communicate with the database. And then the other thing I do is I expose what's called a db set for each of the types in my model. So we'll create a db set of categories. we'll call this categories. This is the property that I'm going to interact with when I want to query instances of categories or I want to save new instances of categories to the database. Okay. Do we want to dig into this code at all, or do we think that's fairly self-explanatory?
So this concept of a context, this is representing the relationship between those regular old objects that you've got and the connection to the database. Have I said anything about tables and things here?
Not yet. So, but when I do want to talk about tables, this is a place I would do it. So the context is effectively the glue between my MVC model and my relational database. So this is where we set up everything that talks about how EF talks to the database. This is also the object that I create when I want to talk with the database.
Okay, cool.
You could think of this as a session with a database, effectively. Now, I can do configuration inline. Obviously, I haven't told this context what database to connect to yet. So what I could do is here, I could override a method called onConfiguring. And onConfiguring, I have this options builder. An options builder, I can do things like saying, use this SQL Server database, and I set up other settings too.
OnConfiguring is like at the moment that we're setting up.
Yeah, this is like, here's your opportunity to influence what database we connect to, and then other settings. So for example, when I connect to SQL Server, I could set things like the connection time out here as well.
Gotcha.
But in MVC, we don't really do configuration here. We have a startup class, which I think folks have already seen, and that's where we typically do all the configuration. So we're not going to do it here. We're going to swap to startup.cs. And I think you've already walked folks through this configure services method.
Right, so if you look at startup.cs, this is what we saw before. We see the configuration builder at the top there. And then at configure service, we added the services. And the service that we added was MVC.
Yep.
Because our application needed MVC to be used. And then later on, we called use MVC.
Yeah, absolutely. And so our controllers, when we write them, they can make use of services as well.
Okay.
And so the context simply becomes a service. This is some component that parts of my application might want to make use of.
Okay.
And so obviously, if I have a controller that wants to do data access, it's going to want the context as a service to be able to use it. All right, so you can see here I've stubbed out a bit of code. I have my connection string stored in a variable here. A little later, this is obviously not the right place to put a connection string, so we'll look at moving it a little later. So we're going to access the services, and we're going to say add entity framework. So this adds all the services that entity framework needs to function within our application. This would be the same as the add MVC line we have above, where MVC is adding all the services it needs.
So it's making it available to the system.
Yeah. We also want to target SQL Server, and because Entity Framework is broken up, we have lots of different providers. I may want to target Oracle, I may want to target MySQL. So we need to add the services for the provider or providers that we want to use. So this is just saying make all the services required to connect to SQL Server available.
All right.
And then I also mentioned we want to make our context available as a service as well. And so we have a helper method off here called addDBContext.
And the DB context in this case would be the one that we just made called product context.
Absolutely. So product context.
Now, and then right there you did the adding of the namespace to make that available.
Yeah, I didn't have the model's namespace imported here. So now I mentioned we want to configure the context to tell it what database to connect to. Now I could have done that inline in the context, but startup.cs is a great place to do it. So this addDBContext method has an overload which allows me to set up the options. And the options object that I'm working on here is the exact same one I would be working on in the onConfiguring method. So options, and then I have a method here that says use SQL Server. And this is an extension method that's available because I have the SQL Server provider installed. And when we looked at the NuGet packages, we saw entityframework.SQL Server installed. And then obviously the only thing SQL Server needs to know is the connection string for the database to connect to.
All right.
So we're going to give it that connection string I have stored in the variable above. All right, so at this point we have a model. Those were the POCO classes. We have a context that we wrote by hand that represents a session with the database, and we've registered that context as a service so that it's available throughout our application. So we have everything done on the .NET side, but at the moment we don't have a database. Now I can use EF to connect to an existing database. If we have time, we'll look at that at the end. But in my case, I want to take my EF model and I want to use that to maintain a database for me.
Okay.
All right, so to do that, we need to use something called migrations. Migrations is specific to relational databases and allows me to use my model to create a database and then to make changes to my model and incrementally push those changes to my database over time.
Okay, so if I have product and I've got price, but now I'm adding taxes, it's another thing. It's a new property.
Yep.
So then it'll be a new column in my table.
Absolutely.
Therefore, it's a new version of my database.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. When I have migrations, I have an ordered set of migrations, and you'll see in a minute they're ordered by timestamp, the time they were created. And so migration 1 might say, create the product and category schema for me. Create those two tables with a relationship between them. And then later on, if I introduce, say, a photo property to my product, then I would go ahead and have a second migration or a second version of the database that says the incremental change you need to do is to add the photo column to the database. And this is the data type it is, and this is whether it's nullable or not. And if it's not nullable, here's the default value you should use for existing data.
Okay.
All right. Now, we're currently demoing some pre-release bits. So typically when you use migrations in other project systems, like a console app or a WPF app, you would use migrations via Package Manager console. We would have some PowerShell commands here, like add migration and update database.
Right. This is a little prompt that people who use Visual Studio can use to access some of the more advanced techniques.
Yep, and this has been true from Entity Framework 4.3 onwards. You've used Package Manager console to use migrations.
Okay.
That's not enabled yet in the pre-release bits we have, so we're actually going to swap out to a command line, which you don't have to do this. You can do this if you want to, but by the time we have a stable release and folks are actually using this to write real applications with, then you'll have the option of Package Manager console and staying within Visual Studio.
Okay.
All right. So just very quickly, have we looked at commands in ASP.NET yet?
We've only looked at, what we've looked at so far is web, and that web exists as a command, but we haven't spent any time looking at project.json because a lot of people don't need to look at it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll very quickly go over this and just say that we have installed, remember, the Entity Framework.commands package. So project.json is just, it lists out all the packages I have referenced. So we'll see I have Entity Framework commands here. And then I also have a command section further down, and you'll see the web command that you talked about. And we also have an EF command registered, pointing to that commands package we have installed. Okay, so I have a command prompt open here. I'm CD'd into my project directory. So if I do this, I'll see, that's the same contents from my project directory.
Okay.
And so to access those commands, you would have typed dnx.web. I'm going to type dnx.ef. And we'll see that we get a command line tool for using Entity Framework.
Nice ASCII art there.
Yeah, the unicorn courtesy of you a while back in EF 4.1. So one of the commands we have here is migration. And I want to add a migration. And I'm going to run this, and then we're going to go over what this is doing. So when I add a migration...
And is initial schema just what you decided to call it?
Yeah, that's an arbitrary name for the new migration that I'm adding.
Okay.
So it looks at my previous model. Now, I've never done anything with migrations before, so my previous model would be a non-existent model or an empty database. And it looks at the current state of my model, which now has a product and a category class, and it works out what changes need to be applied to the database to make the schema work with my existing model.
Okay.
Now, I don't have a database at the moment, so this is a very easy comparison. It's create whatever schema is needed in a database to store my objects.
So the versioning, as we move from version to version, is from the I have no database at all version to the initial layout of the database. So I would assume where it says they're writing migration to, and it gives you a file name.
Absolutely.
We would look at that and it would say, here are the instructions one needs to make a database given products and categories.
Yep. So you could think of this as migration 1. Now, we don't use 1 because obviously we can't do sequential IDs. If you're working in a team environment, you would end up with 5 people generating migration 5. So we actually use a timestamp to do ordering. So we'll go back to Visual Studio and we'll see that a migrations folder has popped up here. And we'll see that there's an initial migration here. Like I said, it has a timestamp on it. And exactly like you said, if we look in here, there's a bunch of code that expresses in C# the changes that need to be applied to the database. So effectively, we're creating 2 tables, a category and a product table here.
All right.
Yep. Now, if I want to, I can edit this code. Maybe I want to change data types in the database or things like that. For the most part, I can just review this, make sure it's doing the right things. And if it is, then I can go ahead and apply it to the database.
Could someone who was more advanced write this themselves and not go out to the command line, or do you usually want to use that tool to make these?
So I think you would normally want to use the tool just because it does a whole lot for you. But yes, if you want to, you can write these things from scratch yourself.
Okay, that sounds like an advanced technique.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're making more and more steps towards making this the components that make up migrations completely stand alone. So you don't even have to be using EF to use migrations if you wanted to. Yep. Okay, so the one other file I want to point out here, and I don't really want to drill into the implementation of it, but you'll see there's a product context model snapshot here.
Okay.
So this is how EF knows what your model looked like last time it generated a migration. So when it comes time to generate migration number 2, EF is going to look at the snapshot stored in this file, and it's going to look at your current model and perform a diff to work out what needs to change in the schema.
I see. So that's how it has the context and knows enough about what to do next when you make a new version.
Absolutely, yeah. All right, and then the command we use to apply migrations to the database. We're going to use dnx.ef and then migration again, but instead of add, we're going to use apply.
Applying the one that we just made.
Absolutely, yeah. So apply will, what it does is it applies any pending migrations to the database. And so at the moment, I just have one migration. My database didn't exist. We connected up to a database called products on my local DB instance. And so that database didn't exist. So what migrations has done is it's created the database and then applied the schema changes in the first migration.
Okay. So now at this moment, a table exists in the database?
Yep. So let's go refresh my databases here.
Oh, and there's products and
we go look
tables,
inside it.
Category and product.
Absolutely.
And then if you opened up like product, there's probably nothing in there. And there's some columns. There you go. So those columns line up directly with the object's properties that you had.
Absolutely. So let's take a quick look at that because there's obviously some stuff happening here because I didn't tell it what the primary key was and I didn't tell it what the foreign key constraints were. So EF has a set of conventions. The table name will match the type name. The column names will match the property names. If there's a property called ID or the type name followed by ID, then it will be automatically set up as the primary key.
Okay.
If it's an integer column, it will automatically be set up as identity in the database, meaning that values will be generated for us. And it also detected that there was a relationship between product and category, and I happen to have a property called category ID, which is a prime candidate for a foreign key. So it's wired that up as the foreign key.
Okay.
All right, we'll look later at how you would go about overriding these conventions if it doesn't detect what you want. Now, the other table here is the migration history table. I mentioned that when I run the apply migrations command, it only applies pending migrations that have not already been applied to the database. And this migration history table is how it keeps a track of what has been applied to the database. So if we go look at this quickly, we'll see there's a single entry in here that says that the initial schema migration that I created has been applied to the database. And so in the future, when we create more migrations, it will look in this table to see which ones have not been applied to the database.
Okay.
Now, this is important because I don't just apply my migrations to my local database. Other developers are going to use these to get my changes onto their database. Obviously, when we deploy to production, we may want to use a script instead of the actual migrations, but these things will be used to create the database and then deploy future versions of it as well.
All right.
Okay, so now we have a model. We have a database. It's time to write some code to actually access that database.
All righty.
Now, we've already covered how controllers work. So I have an existing category controller here. And I've stubbed out some code here, and we're going to walk through and implement the data access aspects of this.
Okay. So right now, you've got an index method and a create method.
Yeah, and I have a few more here too. We'll kind of walk down through them. We've got the ability to basically list all the categories, create new categories. We can edit an existing category, and we can delete an existing category. We're going to implement those actions using EF. Now, to do all this, we want access to the context. So I'm going to create a private field here to hold the instance of the context. So it's going to be
the product context from before.
I'm just going to import the namespace for that. We'll call that underscore context. Oh, that was interesting. And now we were mentioned that the context is registered as a service in our application. So I'm going to create a constructor for our controller. It's going to accept a product context. And then we're just going to take that context and squirrel it away in our private field, which makes it available. So the important thing to note here is I'm not creating an instance of the product context myself. I'm letting MVC give it to me as a service.
Okay.
All right, so to access data from the database, we use what's called LINQ, which just means language integrated query. So this is just a way of expressing a query over some data set using C#. So I'm going to go to my context. I'm going to access the categories property. Remember, this is a DB set of category. There's two different syntax for LINQ. So I'm going to use what's called the method chaining syntax to start with.
We've seen this before when we made our configuration builder where you say something dot something dot something and you kind of go as far as you want to.
Absolutely. So I do a dot order by display name, and then maybe I want to get the results as an array. So I say dot to array.
All right.
It materializes all the data into memory for me. Now, there's another syntax as well, and I'll just show it to you here. So I can also say from C in context.categories, order by C.display name, and then I would also want to cast that result to an array. Oh, actually, we need to say what we want to select, so we want to select out C, and then we would want to say to array to actually pull the results of that query into memory.
All right, so let's just break this down for a second.
Yep. So before we break it down, I just want to be clear that those two pieces of code I just wrote, the one where I chained all the methods together and the one where I wrote this, they do exactly the same thing.
They do exactly the same thing.
Yep. This is just sugar over that method chaining.
And this sugar, kind of, if you're familiar with SQL, right, the structured query language that people use to talk to databases, this is like a friendly, strongly typed version of that.
Yep. It has less lambdas in it, and a lambda is where I do that little thing with the arrow like this. If that's less comfortable to you, then writing in comprehension syntax is what this is called, can be a little easier.
Cool.
All right. So we'll leave it with this. So this gets all our data from the database and it passes it to our view, which is going to display the results. But at the moment, we don't have any data in our database, so we obviously need to implement a little bit more of our controller here. So the create method I have here, when I do an HTTP GET on the create action, this method's going to get called. To create a new instance of a category, there's no need to pass any data from the database to the view because they're going to enter all the data for us, so there's nothing to do there. But when the data comes back, when they post the form where they're creating a new category, then we need to do something. So you'd already talked about model binding, where MVC will take the data out of the form and create an instance of the category object for me.
Right, we posted a person object and a person appeared at this moment.
Yep, so now we're posting a category and a category thing is going to appear at this moment. Now what we want to do is take that category and save it to the database. So I'm going to go to my context. I'm going to say categories. Again, this is the DB set. And I'm going to simply say add. Now it's important here, methods like add aren't saying insert this into the database right now. They're saying queue this up to be inserted when I call save changes. A context, like I said, it represents a session, and so I can make multiple changes and then flush all those changes to the database. And to flush all the changes, I say context.saveChanges. Now another important thing to point out here is that save changes always operates in a transaction. So this is an atomic operation. Everything succeeds or everything fails.
Okay, so everything succeeds or everything fails. So when I'm saying add this or add that or make a change to this, I don't have to worry about it getting halfway done.
Absolutely, yes. So obviously when I'm inserting one category, by default that's either going to fail or succeed. But if I was inserting 3 categories in a product and it fails on inserting the product, then everything is going to get rolled back. By default, everything's transactional.
Makes sense.
Cool. So let's keep going down. When we want to edit, we obviously want to pull back the data for the specific category that folks want to edit. So we're going to go to the context, and we're going to again go to the categories. This time we're going to filter, and we're going to say where the category ID is equal to the ID that was passed into our action. And then in this case, we're expecting a single result. So I'm just going to use the single method to pull back a single result. And we're then going to take that single category and pass it to the view and allow the view to display the data for us.
All right.
When that form gets posted back to the server, again, all the new values that should be stored for this category are going to get bound into a category object and passed to our action for us. And so we're going to say context.categories, and instead of add, this time I'm going to call update. So we'll update the category. And then again, of course, we want to save changes out to the database. So there's a few different patterns I can use to update and save things.
Right, because maybe you updated only one property.
So this is a very heavy-handed approach to update. It's the simplest. I basically take the object and I say, make whatever's in the database look exactly like this.
Okay.
And so EF is going to update every property. Now, there's lots of other patterns I can do. I can also query back for the category from the database and then apply, kind of do a merge and apply only the properties that have changed.
Okay.
And there's patterns for doing that as well. But for a starting point, this is the easiest way to get data into the database.
Okay.
All right. I'm just going to copy this query here where we pull back the category from the database because we're going to need that in the next couple of actions. So again, delete, when they call an HTTP GET on the delete, we simply want to display the category just to confirm that this is in fact the category that they want to delete. So we'll use the same query to get that from the database and then display it. And then when they've confirmed that it is the category they want to delete, again, there's a few different patterns I could do here, but my action's just taking in the ID to delete. And so I'm going to query and get that category from the database. And then I'm going to say context.categories and remove that instance of the category and then save changes. All right, so we just wrote a bunch of code.
Yeah, we should go back over it one at a time.
Yeah, so there's really two different things we did here. One is we used link to query for data from the database. And so the two types of link queries we saw were this one where we were pulling back a single object. So here we used a where clause to filter down to a subset of data. We expect that subset to just have one record.
Right.
So we use single to materialize a single record. And then back up in the index method, we used a link query. In this case, we used the comprehension syntax here. We applied some ordering over the data. And in this case, we don't have a single result. We have an enumerable result. So we use toArray to get the data record.
We get a list of categories.
Yeah. There's also like toList and toHashSet and toDictionary and various other ways to materialize the data.
All right.
And then the other thing we did is we used the insert, update, delete methods on the DB set. And so these are called add and update and remove to align with the kind of C# concept of adding and removing and updating stuff. And so we would, on categories, we would call add or update or remove, and then we would call save changes to push those changes to the database.
Okay.
So we did query and we did update operations. Now, I've already implemented the views for this controller. They're very simple. They're probably what folks have already seen. So let's go ahead and run the application and see if everything works.
Yeah, your views just have text boxes and regular input boxes.
Yeah, you'll see when we go here that the index one just renders a simple table with all the data in it.
Yep.
So we'll go to categories controller. Obviously no data in our table at the moment because there isn't anything.
Good reminder.
So remember, categories have a category ID, which we get to supply. It's just a string. See, I've been playing around with a bit of data here. So we'll create a clothing category. And then maybe we want to create a food and drink category as well. All right, and we can see all the data coming to and from the database here. Anything we want to dig into here while we have a
Let's take a look.
application?
So let's do an edit and then put it in a breakpoint and see that happen in a live debugging session.
Sounds good. So let's go down to the edit method. We want to set a breakpoint when it posts back once the edit's complete.
Right?
Well, actually, let's step through both sides of it, so the get and then the post.
Okay.
All right, so let's go edit the food and drink one. Decide we don't like that one. We want to call it and. I guess I don't have the debugger attached at the moment, so let's relaunch with the debugger attached.
Okay. We did a whole section on debugging, showing how to do watches and locals in interactive stuff.
Obviously, things take a little longer to fire up when we have a debugger attached.
Indeed.
So we'll go edit this guy. All right, so now we hit our breakpoint.
Perfect.
So we see we're running a link query here.
Okay, so we're doing an edit, and our ID is?
Our ID should be food and drink.
Food and drink.
Yeah, that's the ID we gave
At this point, category is null because we haven't asked for it and received it out of the database yet.
Absolutely. And then we'll step over this. Now, it's interesting to point out with link that just creating a query doesn't actually talk to the database. We only talk to the database when we actually ask for the results. And so the methods that ask for results are things like .single, because that says, give me the single result of this query. Or .toArray, because that says, give me the results as an array.
I see. So you're saying that the query is just a query, it's a question, but the .single or the .array is the period at the end of the sentence that actually causes it to happen.
Yeah, it says, give me the answer.
Gotcha.
All right, so if we step over this line of code, then category is now populated.
Okay, so does it mean that at that moment, a SQL query was written by you and sent to a database and real data came back? That was the moment.
I actually have the profiler running here, so we can see it.
Can you zoom in on that?
Yeah.
So this is an advanced tool that we would use to look at what's happening, but Rowan is seeing the internals of the SQL Server and how it thinks. So he can actually see the moment when, there it is, when that query, so you got to write in a nice, friendly format.
Yep.
And it wrote this. Now, certainly, there are people who write SQL like this.
Absolutely.
But what's great about the Entity Framework is that it'll do a lot of the heavy lifting for you.
Yeah, and the other nice thing is it gives you a bit of a layer of indirection between your .NET classes and your database. So if you change a column in your database, you don't have to go back and rewrite all your .NET classes and all your application code to reflect that change. You can simply tweak the mapping in EF, and all your application code stays the same.
Exactly.
Yep. Now, one very important thing to note here is that EF did parameterization for you. So you'll see here in the query, we have a parameter for category ID.
Well, what is parameterization, and why would I?
So this
what do I think
protects
about
you
that?
from SQL injection. So another way you can imagine to solve this problem is to do basically append strings together. So you could say my query is where category ID equals, and then I just string append the value in there. Now the problem is, if I'm smart, I could post to that controller with a string value that says, you know, end quote, colon, delete star from product. And then all of a sudden I have what's called a SQL injection attack, where somebody is using the fact that I'm doing string concatenation to go and
I
do
see.
other stuff that I wasn't intending
So
for. to be able to do.
someone could put in that the name of a category is drop tables.
Yeah, exactly.
I see.
And so then at that point, the person has access to run arbitrary SQL against my database.
And this protects you from that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. So let's go back to our interactive debugging session.
Okay, so let's hit F5.
So we're returning the category to the view. The view then will show that returned object.
Yep, so I'll do that, and we'll see
Yep, and there's
it's
food and
displayed
drink.
on the screen. Obviously, category ID being the primary key is not editable. I can't go changing primary keys.
All right.
But display name is. So we'll change that to food and drink. And when I hit update, we're going to post back.
Okay, so then at this moment, the category there, if we can hover over that and open that up, that's not the category from the database. That is the category that we just typed into our form and sent back to the back end.
Absolutely. So this category, EF doesn't know anything about this instance of the category. This is just MVC has created an instance and assigned the values from the form to it.
Now, when you say model state is valid, you're making sure that what is valid?
I'm making sure that all the rules I've defined on my object, like what properties are required and things like that,
Right,
I'm
and we
making
saw
sure
that.
that all those rules are met. Now that
Exactly.
stuff should be validated on the client, but if someone wanted to be smart and try and get around those controls on the client, they could configure construct their own post request and send that to me.
Right.
So I'm also checking on the server that what they're sending me is actually valid.
So in the module with Glenn, we put in required and string length.
Yep.
That was sent out to the client. The browser would tell us, oh, your first name is too long.
Yep.
This is a double check.
Yeah, to make sure someone
the server
hasn't
side.
said, well, the web page is stopping me
Right.
doing that, but how about I just send my own post using whatever tools?
Right.
And
They could have been an evil browser.
absolutely.
Okay.
Yep.
So you check to see that that's valid. You make sure that those constraints, string length or whatever, are set.
Yes, in this case
Okay.
they are.
All right. And then when you say update, how does it know that this category lines up to the other? Is it the ID?
The primary key value, yep. So EF isn't going to do anything with the database at this stage. It's just going to trust you. And it's going
Okay.
to say, okay, you have this category. And if we look at it, we know that its primary key is set to FDR. And it's going to say, okay, I'm going to start tracking this as an existing category with all of its properties modified.
Okay.
So if we do that,
Now, at this moment, have you queued up the update but haven't actually done it?
that's right. This thing is sitting in what's called the change tracker. So EF has a component that's responsible for monitoring changes and keeping a track of those. And so the change tracker knows that this is a modified instance of a category that needs to be saved to the database,
Okay.
but nothing has been done about that yet.
Okay.
That is where this next call comes into play. Context.saveChanges takes everything out of the change tracker and gives it to the database provider to store in the database.
Gotcha.
Now, obviously, the way that gets translated to SQL depends on the database you're targeting. So it's going to give it to SQL Server and say, hey, I have this update to category. Please go turn that into SQL and apply it to the database.
Okay. So then at this moment, as you step over, that will occur.
Yep, so we'll do that, and then I'm going to swap to the profiler. And we'll see here there's an update that occurred.
Update category set the display name, where the category ID equals this category ID of FDR.
And again, you can see we're not putting the values in line because that would leave us open to a SQL injection attack. We're using the SQL Server feature called parameterization to make sure that the actual literal values are stored in the columns.
All right.
All right, so let's run that. And
Then we go back to index. Now this, go back there again for me. We didn't talk too much about this before. Redirect to action. We're in the edit method.
Yep.
Now we're saying, well, now that we're done doing edit,
Yes.
let's go back and show them the list again. And we'll remember that in index, that will go to the database
Yep.
and get the now updated list and present that list.
Absolutely, yeah. So,
And
and then
we
if we
see
go to
that-
the screen, we
and
see
we see that it worked.
We see that food and drink is updated to use the word and instead of the ampersand sign now.
Very cool.
All right, so we have basic data access up and running, and these same rules apply. Basically, you can construct more and more complicated link queries. You can do edits where you're inserting more than just one object at a time. But essentially, any data access you do using Entity Framework and MVC, you're building on these same fundamental principles we just looked at.
So these are the tools that you will use to create. In this case, we just made a 2-column something.
Yep.
But you could make whatever you want. You could make a blog. You could make your own Amazon.com. Whatever makes you happy.
Yeah. So I think the other tool we need to give folks is we've looked at creating an initial database to match my model, but I think it would be good to look at what do I need to do if I want to make changes to my model now?
Okay.
How do I apply those changes?
So we could add a column potentially.
Yeah, let's do that. So we'll go back to Visual Studio. I'm just going to stop the debugger.
And we remember that when we made this first database, we went from the nothing database to the one that has these columns.
Yep.
You're talking about making either a change to a column where you might say, well, first name can be longer now.
Yep.
Or the addition of an entirely new.
Yeah, so the addition one's probably the simplest. So let's look at that first. So I'll go to my models. Let's just go to product. And so I'm going to introduce a string property called description. All right, so we're going to use the same commands at the command line that we saw before. So the first one we're going to use, I'll just clear the command line first so we start fresh. So we're going to go dnx.ef to invoke the ef commands, migration, add, and we'll call this one, we'll just call it description. We can call it whatever we want.
All right.
Or my migration number 2 or something. All right, so let's talk about what ef just did. It looked at the model snapshot, remember, that we have stored in the migrations directory in our project.
All right.
It looked at the current state of our model and said, what's changed? And it worked out that the thing that had changed is we introduced the new description property. And so then it deduced from that I need to introduce a description column to the product table in the database.
So it was smart enough to look at those two objects, the new one and the one it knew about before.
Absolutely.
And it diffed them. It made a difference between the two.
Yeah, and so one question we often get is why do we use a snapshot? Like, why don't we go and look at the database schema? The reason we use the snapshot is because that allows us to be quite smart, because the database schema only represents the database portion of your model. The snapshot we have represents everything. It represents the properties that they map to and the types they map to. And so if we just looked at the database schema, if you did something like change the column name that a property mapped to, then at the database schema, all we'd see is that there's a new property and an old property that's removed. And we don't know if that's a rename or a drop and a create. If I look at the EF model, then I can see that both of those columns actually wire up to the same property in my .NET class. And so that's obviously just a column rename on the same property. So by looking at the model snapshot, we can be a lot more intelligent about how we perform the diff.
Okay.
All right?
So go ahead and show that file that was created, that migration file.
Yep. Now you'll see the timestamps coming into play here.
There's a second one there.
Things are nicely ordered. So
Okay.
I'm getting things in the order they're going to be applied to the database. I'll open this file, and we'll see this one's much simpler. We're just going to add a column, and we capture all the data that we need to create that column in the database.
I see. So on the way up to this version, this newer version, we add this, and I can see it says down. If I wanted to go backwards to an older version of the database, I would just remove that column.
Yeah, so that's,
and lose data.
That's a very important thing to note, is that migrations are ordered steps, and so I can go up and down through those steps as I want.
Okay.
All right. So remember, do we just use the apply migration? So dnx.ef, migration, apply, to apply these changes to the
Now, do I have to say apply description or apply number 2, or will it just take me to the latest?
It will take you to the latest, so you can tell it to go to a particular version, but by default, most people, you want to go to the latest version, because
Okay.
typically what you do is you have some migrations that have not been applied to the database.
Okay.
Now, the important thing to note here is this doesn't go and apply the last migration, it applies any pending migrations. And so you'll remember that we had the migration history table in the database. It records which migrations have been applied to this particular instance of the database. EF can look in your project and say, well, I have 2 migrations here. I have the initial schema one we created, and I also have this new description migration. When I look in the migration history table, I can see, well, the initial schema one's already been applied. That's recorded in the table, but this description one has not.
I see. So it's using the database itself as a way to track what version the database is.
Yeah. My project has a list of versions in it. My database knows what version it's at, and so I can go and apply all the pending ones to the database.
Very cool.
Yep.
Can we see that database updated and see if that all
absolutely.
there?
So I'm going to swap to SQL Management Studio.
Maybe zoom in on that, and we're going to look. We made a change to
product. I'm just going to refresh the columns. Then I will zoom in, and
there
you'll
it
see
is.
the new description column there.
Very cool. Okay, so then that's now available, and I could add a form field for that and just go about my business.
Yep, absolutely. So we've got a couple of minutes left. We talked about how EF uses conventions to work out the shape of my model. Now, when I constructed my Poker classes, I just happened to follow those conventions. I called my primary keys the type name followed by ID. I named my foreign key appropriately so that EF could find it. And EF also picked some data types for me. It also picked column names for me, so maybe I don't like that stuff. Maybe I want to override it. So there's 2 ways to do that. We have what's called the Fluent API, which is a C#. I write some code in my context to talk about how things map to the database.
Right.
Or I have data annotations, which are just attributes that I put on my classes to define some extra mapping.
Okay.
All right, so let's go to the context. Because most people like to keep that mapping information, particularly when I'm talking about the database, I want to keep it separate from their classes. Their classes, they may want to put things like required on there, which I think you guys looked at, in string length.
Right.
But when it comes to specifying column names and things, they typically want to keep that out of their domain objects.
Okay.
So in our context, we're going to go override the onModel creating method. And so this gives us a hook to influence how the model is created. Now you see here that by default, when I override this method, Visual Studio puts in a call to base.onModel creating.
Right.
That implementation is empty, so I'm actually safe to delete that call. I could leave it in if I wanted to, it's harmless, but it's not needed. So we want to pull up Model Builder, which is a parameter that gets passed into this method for us.
Okay.
And then I can pull up the configuration for a particular entity. So let's pull up category. Now this is called a Fluent API because I kind of fluently chain method calls together. It's a very similar pattern to what we saw when we were using link. So now that I'm drilled into that entity, you can see I want to drill into a property. So I'm going to pull up the configuration for the display name property. Now you'll notice here I'm using line breaks to help format the code, but effectively this is all one line of code. So it could all be just stuck together on one line if we wanted to.
And this is that pattern that we see a lot. We saw this with the configuration builder where you're chaining these things, this, dot this, dot this.
Yeah, and in this case I'm kind of drilling down. So I've said, give me the model builder, which represents the whole model. I want to drill down into the category object. From there I want to drill down into the property object. And from there I want to do things like saying, this is a required property. So in this, I could also go and put the required attribute on the property.
And is that just a decision that someone gets to make? Because we made required on the domain object, on the main object, because that fed the HTML form, and that seemed like a reasonable.
So that would actually be a good thing to do in an MVC application.
Okay.
To do that. We're going to do it here. And I could also say it has a column name because I don't like the default one, or maybe my DBA doesn't like the default one. So I'm going to call it display_name.
I see. So you want the object to be called .displayName. Everywhere in your MVC application, you're going to refer to it as display_name, but at the moment that it gets persisted to the database, it's display_name, lowercase.
Yep. So obviously this is going to result in schema changes. We're going to change the column to be required or not nullable, and we're going to change the column name itself.
Okay.
So to do that, we need to use migrations. So using the techniques we've already seen.
And it will notice that you wrote that code?
Yes.
Did you have to compile beforehand?
Migrations will compile for you.
Oh, very cool.
So from the command line, we'll actually compile to make sure we get the latest.
Okay.
I'm going to give this a name. I'm just calling it some tweaks because we're making some tweaks. You can see I get a warning here. Now, because I'm potentially changing the data type of one of my column, It's giving me a warning to say that could result in data loss. Now, SQL Server is actually smart enough to know that if I'm going from a non-nullable column, sorry, a nullable column to a non-nullable column, and there's null data in there, that it will just throw and it will give us an error and it won't apply the changes.
Okay.
So you now see we have a third migration here.
All right, and inside there, alter column, rename column.
Yep.
Very cool.
So an alter, the nullable is being changed to false, and we see the new name being applied here. And of course, very quickly, if we go and apply this migration,
So then at that moment, the database changed.
yeah. So if we go to categories here, look at the columns, and I'll just zoom in on display name, we'll see that it's now marked as not nullable, and the column name has changed to display underscore name.
Very cool.
All right, so I think we've covered the basic techniques you need to get up and running with EF, and anything you'd want to do just kind of builds on what we've already covered here.
Very cool. So this is our introduction to using databases and Entity Framework with ASP.NET 5. Thanks so much for joining us for this module.